ain't going back. Not gonna buy into all that. Hey, hey, ain't gonna hide, gonna let all the fears slide. Got mother nature is on my side. Got all of the loving growing inside.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to the New Now. I'm delighted to finally have Paul Levy on with us. I've been reading and sharing and enjoying his publications for many, many years now, from Understanding Wetiko, Undreaming Wetiko, Dispelling Wetiko, and I bet you guys can guess what we're going to talk about today. Paul, welcome to the show.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here with you. Really, thank you so much for the invite.
So I would love to start with your definition, even though I've seen it's a very long definition and we can go over, many books of it. Maybe a short definition of Wetiko and get into it from there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's a Native American term, which in a way, there are a lot of ways of translating it or describing it. One way it's a cannibalistic spirit. It's this spirit really that inspires evil, both individually and collectively. And it's basically what our species is suffering from. It's a mind virus. And one can think of it as sort of, in a very real way, as a form of being blind. It's a psychic blindness, but it's a peculiar form of psychic blindness that actually believes that it's sighted. And not only so it doesn't know it's blind, it believes it's sighted, but it actually thinks that it's more sighted than people who actually see. And when people hear this idea of Wetiko, a mind virus, and they can get edged out and think, oh, that's all, new agey or woo-woo. But all it really means, in essence, is that the origin of the collective madness that's playing out in our world is to be found within the psyche. And not only the origin, but the solution of the madness is to be found within the psyche. And that's a no-brainer. Like, where else in the world could it be found? And so Wetiko, it operates through we all project. So through the projective tendencies of the mind is the way Wetiko operates, in such a way that we then entrance ourselves via our own projections. In a way, we hypnotize ourselves. And so I could go on and on describing Wetiko, but I should just point out a couple things. So first off, it's a quantum phenomenon. What I mean by that is that, just like in quantum physics, in the double slit experiment, they discovered the nature of light either will manifest as a wave or a particle, depending on how it's observed. The same thing with Wetiko. It's the source of the greatest evil that we're capable of acting out. And it contains its own vaccine, its own medicine. And not only that, it's actually helping us to evolve. Okay. So it's a very profound thing that spiritual traditions throughout history, and not only spiritual traditions, but also artists and philosophers and thinkers, and this is why I've written 3 books on the topic, they're all pointing at Wetiko. And even in the Castaneda books, Carlos's teacher, he doesn't have the name Wetiko, he calls it the predator, and he says this is the topic of topics. And so there's nothing more important. And even in the apocryphal text, I'll end with this, they talk about Wetiko. They don't call it Wetiko because it's called by different names, but in the apocryphal text they call it the counterfeiting spirit. And so the idea is it has no creativity at all. But to the extent that we're not consciously expressing ourselves creatively, which is our nature, the Wetiko mind virus will plug into our creativity and turn it against us. And the thing about this counterfeiting spirit, it has no creativity, but it's a master impersonator. So it will put us on. It will impersonate us. Putting us on means to fool us, but also, like putting on a suit of clothes, it will actually present this limited version of ourselves. Oh, I'm wounded, I'm traumatized. And if we're not awake in that moment and we then identify with Wetiko's image of ourselves, then it has us. Then it can control us, and we're just we're like a puppet on a string. And so if you think about what I'm describing, we actually, you see, Wetiko can't steal our soul, but it tricks us. It's a trickster into giving our soul away. Then we identify with who we're not. Then we forget who we actually are. And then we disconnect from our creative agency. That's a recipe for madness. And that's really Wetiko in a nutshell.
How would you define it as cannibalistic? You mentioned cannibalistic. So what do you mean by that, cannibalistic virus?
Yeah, well, that's in the indigenous tradition. When you study the way they would actually conceive of Wetiko, they call it a cannibalistic spirit in that it actually takes from the earth and from other beings its energy without, sort of offering anything back. And so in that sense, it's cannibalistic. And even more ultimately, it cannibalizes oneself. When we become the host for the Wetiko virus, mind virus, it actually destroys everything within its sphere of influence. So our relationships, our lives, our job, or everything will get destroyed. And when a species like our species is under the thrall of Wetiko, you see what's happening. The whole biosphere is getting destroyed, and we're potentially destroying not only the human species, but potentially all species, including ourselves. So when we unwittingly become a host for Wetiko, typically we're oblivious to it. We've never felt more ourselves, and yet something other than ourselves has come in and taken our place. It's like we've been deposed from the throne, which is really ours. And then Wetiko will act itself out in this self-destructive way, through our addictions, through our habitual patterns, and then it will ultimately destroy the host. But it doesn't want to do that too soon, because if it does it too soon, then it has to suffer the inconvenience of finding a new host. And what I'm describing, this isn't anything new. I'm just a translator. I'm a modern Western person translating this indigenous wisdom of every single spiritual tradition in the history of this planet, and I'm just translating it into a modern psychological idiom. And Wetiko underlies addiction, it underlies trauma. It's at the bottom, it's at the root, it's the very source of the madness and the evil that's playing out in our world.
Where would you say its origins may be? Do you have an idea about that?
Well, that's really interesting. No, I've written about that, and I've thought about that a lot. And I'm really open. I entertain, one of the superhero powers that you have to develop when you go really inwards and encounter, this level of the psyche, of darkness and light, is you develop what I call an omni-perspectival, you could say, consciousness or awareness, in that you're able to entertain all points of view, without knowing what's actually true. And there are some people who talk about, there was this collective trauma that happened, to our species a number of centuries ago. Other people talk about, there were these negative ETs that did something to our DNA or whatever. And I'm open to all of that. But what I find, you see, this is, I'll just take a step back to answer this. One of my inspirations is the great psychiatrist, Carl Jung. And Carl Jung was super switched on to Wetiko. He didn't have the name. He called it by different names. And the one name he called it the most of the times was Totalitarian Psychosis. Okay. And he talks about that evil. And how come I so resonate with Jung? I mean, he saved my life because I was having this total extreme state. I had snapped out of the consensus spell, and I was trying to understand what had happened to me. And then I found the work of Jung, and I realized, oh my God, he's mapped this territory. And he really, really talks about evil, and in a way that I super appreciate. And he says, the thing about evil, it regenerates itself over the generations. It recreates itself. Okay. And that's Wetiko. In my new book on Wetiko, the third one, the first chapter is about the origin of Wetiko. And I point out, well, in my opinion, it's not something that exists in the past. and that's affecting us. No, we are unwittingly participating in being complicit with regenerating it and recreating it in this moment and in this moment. And another way of saying that, it's unhealed ancestral trauma. That to the extent that we become traumatized by our parents, or who were traumatized by their parents, and then the grandparents just on down the lineage, to the extent that that trauma and abuse isn't healed and wounded, and not wounded and freed, then we just get compelled to unconsciously enact it on the next of kin. And that evil of the abuse just gets passed down until someone in the family, generation says, no, I'm going to stop just passing this down to my children, and I'm going to do the work. And of course, then when one person really integrates that, I don't understand this, but I feel the truth of it is that it heals the ancestors both back in time and in the future. So that would be my answer, that it's really the multi-generational unhealed ancestral trauma. And I'm talking about myself because I've been, how come I've been so unbelievably interested in this is because I got a personal transmission of Wetiko, in my family, and it was otherworldly. It was like, beyond anything I had conceived of, and it took down and consumed my entire family. And I've spent the last, 40 plus years trying to deal with what actually did I encounter, because it completely changed the whole course of my life. And it could have killed me. I mean, it killed my parents, it destroyed my whole family. And yet I've been fortunate in a way of alchemically transmuting the poison and the evil into medicine. And that's what's hopefully informed my books.
What do you mean by personal transmission?
Oh, well, I mean, I'll give you an example, a more specific example. And I don't need to go into the story, but I'm an only child, and my father, unbeknownst to me, was taken over by something. It was almost like he was deposed, or kind of something had possessed him, particularly, when he would get set off and like a lot of fathers, I think, go into these demonic, murderous rages. And, it was at a certain point he began, and I saw him doing this growing up towards other people, but I was always like the golden child who was good at school and all that. And then as soon as I began to individuate and separate and express my own opinion separate from my father, then I became the recipient of him, just becoming possessed by this supernatural, otherworldly. It was like being possessed by a demon. And it was like he wasn't himself and something entered him. And it was murderous, and it was demonic, and it was evil, and it was violent. And, I don't need to go into the story, but basically he would act this out on me. And, at this point I had developed a strong sense of self. I was in college, I was individuating and figuring out who I was. And then this increasing episodes of this abuse happened, each one getting worse and worse whenever I was expressing my own point of view. And then finally, the worst of the episodes happened. And I woke up the next day with a fever, which I had for a year. And then at the end of that year, that entity that was in my father, this hateful, blaming, rageful, demonic, murderous entity or energy, was now inside of my psyche. It was like he could have exited stage left. And all of a sudden, and what I'm describing is typical of abuse. The external abuser plays out something, they exit stage left. What makes abuse is when we internalize it within the psyche, and then we start doing it to ourselves. It's like we become split in two, and we become our own perpetrator. And that's what happened to me. And that's when I realized I have a big problem. But when I say transmission, it was like I got a transfusion of the Wetiko virus right into my soul, that something evil that was not in me up until that moment, once he, went into this complete demonic rage, and it was like I was a glass vase that got shattered, and something entered me, and I got the transmission. And that was the year of the fever, and there was nothing physically wrong with me, But like I said, at the end of that year, all of a sudden I realized I had a big problem,
Mm.
that like hateful, demonic, murderous, violent energy was living in my psyche, and it was directed at every wholesome, healthy impulse that I was expressing, which was like an internal enactment of the very external abuse. That's when I realized I had a big problem. I was in my early 20s, and what I did with it, I went inwards, because I quickly figured out, even though I was really smart in school, that meant nothing.
Mm.
The only thing that helped was me assuming the position of the witness and just observing what was happening. And I was just doing that hours and hours and hours a day for a couple of years. And then I had an awakening. I got hit by a bolt of lightning, not from the sky, but in my brain. And I went into a complete altered state in which I was beginning to realize, oh my God, we're having a collectively shared dream. That's what this is. And I was 24. I was so ecstatic that people who knew me thought I was having a psychotic break. And I immediately got hospitalized and diagnosed as mentally ill. And I knew I wasn't mentally ill. That's what saved me.
Mm.
And but man, that was the start of my career, of my vocation. It took me years to integrate and go to therapy and connect with my dreams and make art and study Jung and do Buddhist practice and shamanism and anything and every, because the suffering was so overwhelming. And slowly, I guess that was in 81. In 94 is when I began teaching. So it took 13 years of me just doing, and it's not like, oh, I'm all enlightened. No, I'm still a work in progress, like all of us. But at that point in 94, I had the realization, oh, I have a certain sort of gift that I've received via this initiatory ordeal that can help people. And that's what I've been doing ever since. I haven't had to do anything else.
Interesting. I had a similar experience with my mother, exactly as you described it. She had trauma during the war, World War II, and then certainly passed that along to the point where, she's had a stroke recently and she's just not there. I haven't visited recently, maybe 6 months ago, and there's just a demon looking out of her eyes right now. It's very interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Right, totally.
Did I get, I haven't shared this story with anybody. It was really funny. When I visited with my wife for the first time, she even said to me, she looked at me, she goes, she's a lovely woman. I think I'll keep her. Literally, that came out of my mom's mouth. You can go. I'm gonna keep her. And I like looked at her, and she's like, she had a stroke, and she's immobile in a wheelchair. And I'm going, whoa, really
Right.
fascinating.
But if I could just say, that's a thing. That's a real phenomena where people, and that's Wetiko. Wetiko, think about it like a higher dimensional energy or entity or seeming entity. I don't want to invest it with a reality that it doesn't deserve, because ultimately there is no such thing as Wetiko, and yet it can kill us. That's the paradox. There's no such thing as Wetiko separate from our own mind, but there is a real phenomena of whatever we call it, Wetiko or a demon or whatever, a higher dimensional energy that can possess and take over a person. And they become the instrument for that dark force to act itself out. And typically they have no idea. And that's what happened to my father. There were times he would go into rages, and then afterwards he would come back to himself. And I would ask him, Dad, do you remember what was going on for you when an hour ago? And he would have no idea he just couldn't remember a thing because he wasn't there. And it's a real, I think it's important to name this. It's a real psychological phenomena where we become possessed. And I would say not so much by a demon, but by an unconscious psychic force, And if I could just explain that a little bit, because one way of understanding Wetiko in psychology speak, they talk about, okay, we become traumatized. Well, what happens in trauma? There's an overwhelming experience that we can't symbolize or integrate. And so we split, we disassociate. And then that split off part, if we don't integrate it, back into our conscious awareness and wholeness, it develops an autonomy. And in psychology, or like a seemingly independent life and will of its own, and psychologically speaking, it's called an autonomous complex. The indigenous people call an autonomous complex a demon. And that's a way of understanding Wetiko. It's a split off part of our psyche that belongs to us, to our wholeness, and it will manifest as if it's an entity with a seeming adversarial will of its own, and that's against us, like being ourselves and all that. And that's a really simple way of understanding what the Native American people were calling Wetiko.
Well, how would you equate that, since you mentioned Castaneda, to Don Juan mentioning, they gave us their mind, the predator's mind?
Yeah. That's exactly it. Like, in other words, if you think about it, think about, I mean, there are a lot of ways I can go into that, but just the thought that fell in my head, think about when people are acting out their addictions, right? And their addictions, by definition, are not serving them. It's not serving life. It's serving, like, the counterforce to life. And all of a sudden, you'll have a hard day at work and you'll hear a voice going, oh, I deserve to have that, whatever, fill in the blank, that glass of wine, that joint, that cake, or whatever. And then you eat it or drink it and you feel like, shitty, and you feel like shut down, or, and then what do you do with that? Oh, now I need to, like, medicate myself more because now and it becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop whose inspiration is, that counterfeiting spirit. Because the counterfeiting spirit, just remember, it puts you on, it fools you, it impersonates you in your form with your voice. And if you aren't able to distinguish, oh, wait a second, that's the voice of, the predator, like that Don Juan says, that's giving us its mind. Wait a second, I can now objectify it and see it outside of myself. And by doing that, I've distinguished myself from it. I'm here, it's there, and it's not me. Then all of a sudden you're more a choice. But if you don't objectify it and see it as separate from you, then you're going to unconsciously identify with it, and you're going to unwittingly become an instrument to act it out. And it's draining your life force like a vampire. That's what all of these vampire myths and zombie myths and Castaneda, they're all pointing at Wetiko. And why are they pointing at it? For centuries, because people don't see it. Because Wetiko, it's a form of blindness, and it only has power over us to the extent where we don't see it. That's why my whole work is trying to, like, point it out to people. Because when you see it, all of a sudden you take away its power over you and you become empowered.
Well, did you do something, or it sounds like you may have done something akin to a recapitulation? Like, because that was one of the questions I wanted to ask. It's like, if someone can't see it and they're wondering why the world's so crazy. I had a chat with someone yesterday, and you try to explain to them, why there's a psychosis going on, seems planet wide, where everyone's the same in so many ways. Did you do something of that nature in your life to help integrate, the trauma?
Yeah. I mean, I was going to therapy and doing hours of Buddhist meditation a day, and, following my dreams for decades, and plant medicine and shamanism and alchemy and making art, and, recapitulating every single possible thing I could do, but then, the mind only takes you so far, and then it gets into, the heart and into the body and all that. And yeah, so, I mean, I think the only way I'm able to be, really in the position I'm in to bring forth this work, and, like, one way of describing my work is, I'm just shedding light on the darkness. Like, light itself has no value, whatever. What good is light if it doesn't illumine the darkness? This is like, I think there's the famous quote Jung says, we become enlightened not by, sort of imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So it's involved in incredible sort of the shamanic descent. And I knew nothing about shamanism. And I joke with my friends, I'm no shaman. I'm only a shaman in my wildest dreams. But I got enlisted into this deeper shamanic initiatory process, via the abuse. And that's typically what happens. When we get abused or traumatized or wounded, we split. And eventually that catalyzes another part of us going in search of the split off part of ourselves, so that we can, like, remember, put our members back together to retrieve our soul. That's the shamanic journey. And I knew nothing about that in the conceptual, intellectual way or experientially, but that was the deeper archetypal pattern that was activated in me 40 plus years ago. And if I didn't have the courage to do that, because when they say, when somebody gets called to be a shaman, it's not something you would ever do in your wildest dreams. You'd have to be an idiot. You'd have to be crazy, because the suffering is so overwhelming. You can't even imagine the suffering. It's something you're called to do by the spirits. But if you say, no, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not whatever, then typically they say that's when you get really sick and that you can even go crazy and die. But when you say, when you assent to the calling, then all of a sudden the sponsor of the calling will support you in your quest. And a lot of fairy tales talk about this and all that. And I point out that the shamanic archetype, that's the deeper archetype that's activated in the field, in the collective, in our collective species. Because shamanism has to do with, it's you go into the darkness of the underworld, into the unconscious. And I'm not talking as a scholar, no, even though I study and I'm a nerd and all that, but no, I'm talking about from my own experience. And, you have to go through, there's no way around it, going through a death, rebirth experience. It's never just death, but then there's the rebirth. And I'm pointing out that all of us individually and collectively as a species, we are making a shamanic descent. And it's funny, the biggest chapter in my latest book on Wetiko is all about shamanism. And I finished that chapter like 1 week before the lockdown happened, in 2020. And I was saying, we're going through an incredible shamanic descent and we're going through a death rebirth. And the next thing I know, we're all locked down. And I was like, wow, I didn't realize, I did realize how prescient I was being. It wasn't even telling the future. It was just giving voice to what's the deeper archetypal process. And the thing about the shaman, and I talk about this in that chapter, the shaman is the healer who's wounded. It's the wounded healer. The shaman is the storyteller. They're the dreamer. They are the creative artist, because I point out again and again that the greatest medicine for Wetiko is for us to connect with our creative spirit, okay? Because remember, to the extent that we outsource our creativity and are disconnected from it, Wetiko, which has no creativity, plugs into our own creative energy and turns it against us, serving its, sinister ends. And so the idea being the shaman is the wounded healer. And the idea is a shaman is so empathic that they literally take on the illness of the person they're working with or the tribe or the community, and they fall ill. They experience the illness from the inside. But if, and that's this dangerous situation, because if they stay stuck there and stay ill, then they need a shaman. They can't help anybody. But the accomplished shaman takes the occasion of them taking on the illness as an even more like, helping them to more deepen their connection to their own nature, to their own wholeness. And as they do that, and they find their way back to their true nature, energetically, that is imprinted, because we're all not separate, ultimately speaking, in the level of mind, that then gets transmitted to the person or the tribe or the community or the species, making it that all of a sudden a pathway has been cleared in the collective unconscious, where somebody who suffered from that illness has found their way back to their wholeness. And to the extent that any of us can do that, we've all been made crazy by what's happening. How can we not, where we're like not separate from it? We're like dreaming up the insanity. And of course, we're all feeling the stress and the tension and the madness. And to the extent that we just, split off and just make the best of it, well, then we're part of the problem. But for those of us who were like taking that occasion of like the madness in our world and the darkness playing out all over the world as an occasion to even more deepen their connection with their nature, whether they know it or not, they're actually, playing the role of the shaman. They're the antipsychotic agent in the non-local field. And, and that's potentially all of us. And I just want to say that's why this transformation that a lot of us are imagining or hoping that's going to happen, it starts through the individual, and any one of us having that realization of the dreamlike nature, or seeing their shadow, or recognizing Wetiko, or seeing the quantum field. There are a lot of ways of articulating the same idea, just really awakening. Any one of us in this moment having that experience could catalyze a whole global awakening, because we're not separate.
I would agree. I mean, how did you personally give up the victim card? Because I talked to so many people, I've done a lot of similar work, and so many people say, it's their fault, or it's not my fault, or whatever, trauma in childhood, or trauma because of the last
Yeah,
20
yeah, yeah.
years, or what have you. So, again, it
Yeah.
happens every week when I talk to someone. So how did you personally look at that victim card and say, nah?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, for years, I felt, it was totally unfair. I didn't deserve it. My father was just, he had surrendered to the dark side and played, this dark role, this very evil role in the family. He killed his wife, my mother, not murdering her, but she died a broken woman.
Mm.
His parents, according to his one sibling, his sister, they died totally brokenhearted because of him. His sister hated him, and so he was just this conduit or instrument for this incredible evil to play out. And being the only child, I was the one who had front row seats and was the recipient of it. And it was completely unfair. And it was very seductive to play the victim. And for years, I'm sure I did. But then I began to realize, wow, as I more and more began to heal and integrate, and I began to understand, oh, wow, I would never have had these realizations. I would never have been able to write these books that are helping people all over the world without my father playing the role he did. Oh, wow. So was he actually an agent of the dark, or was he an agent of the light disguised as an agent of the dark? And then all of a sudden, as I more and more integrated the realization that, wait a second, we're having a collective dream, well, wait, this deeper part of me dreamed up my father to play that role. He's a dream character. There's no getting away from that. He's not separate from part of me. And yeah, it was really like, screwed up and unfair and terrible. But at a certain point, okay, that was the card I was dealt with. And then my reaction to that, when that trauma comes up, when that wounding comes up, I'm responsible for how I react to that in this moment. There's no one else that I could blame for that, And so I've just had to take responsibility for my own process. And the only place to do that is the present moment. And that's when you begin to realize, wait a second, I'm participating in creating, conjuring up and creating my experience. No one is doing that. Yeah, I have this wound. Okay, how do I respond? That's my responsibility. I can't blame anyone else for that.
Mm. Well, do you think, which would be my, I guess, opinion, that we choose our parents before we come here?
Yeah, well, that became a huge, controversial thing in one of my groups a year or two ago. It's funny because I have all these groups, but I can totally entertain just in the imagination that point of view, and like I think about myself. Yeah, I was lucky to have my mother was just a loving mother, wonderful person, and that was so helpful for me growing up. And the way I see it is that I never would have been able, once my father manifested the way he did and enacted his abuse on me, that I never would have been able to get through it without having had the loving mother I did. And when I reflect back upon my parents, I can really see it through the lens of, yeah, there was something karmic that I needed to experience and I needed to learn. And central casting said the perfect people to play mom and dad. Because our psyches get formed. It's not just we inherit our physical body and DNA, but in a sense, the mother and father we have, we kind of inherit their psyche, their psychic habitual patterns and unconscious. And, kids are so psychically tuned in to the unconscious of the parents, and it formed me. So I can totally, entertain, that possibility of that we, the deeper part of us, that self, chose our parents for sure.
Yeah, I remember Don Juan said we all come in with a distortion to fix. into this dream of
Yeah,
spring. Yeah, and it seems that
right, right,
I always thought that if my parents were a little nicer, if my family was a little nicer, if my parents were a little richer, I would have gotten stuck in a life of everyone else's kind of life. So I kept getting forced into something that wasn't so pleasant, which in the end, as you said, ends up being very pleasant because it allows you to, to grow as a being, especially when you can
right.
face your own darkness, your own challenges. Seems to me there's nothing better to do or nothing else worth doing in this life than
Right.
integrating the challenges.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, totally. What makes me think like one of my teachers, because I'm fortunate of having these incredible teachers. And what one of them, was here, I had brought him out to give some teachings, and he's from Tibet. He's one of the great lamas of Tibet. And he said to me, he goes, the greatest practitioners, they didn't become enlightened because everything was going so great. They became enlightened because there were all these obstacles, and he had probably said that a million times, but I never heard it before. But that time I really heard it, and it made sense to me, because we're at the time in our evolution. I mean, I'm imagine same with you. Everybody I talk to is going through it and just overwhelmed or faced with challenges, or all their shadows that they've been, just avoiding are in their face.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's an amazing time we live in. I mean, really, and part of the amazingness of the time is that then there's this, idea of Wetiko coming into the world. Like in his work, Jung talks about in times of collective psychosis, and Wetiko is a collective psychosis, and our species has gone collectively mad. Jung says in times of collective psychosis, the only thing that can save us is a new symbolic idea. And that's exactly what Wetiko is, and it's a saving idea. And, it makes me think of the one thing, the worst tyrants in the world were the most afraid of was a new idea whose time has come. And in a way, that's the idea of Wetiko. So, for example, when I'll say Wetiko, I mentioned before, ultimately, it doesn't even exist. If people hear about a mind virus and they're getting all afraid, no. The mind virus feeds off of fear. That's its superfood. It has no existence at all separate from our mind, and yet it can kill us. And, so the idea being that, for example, if we see somebody who's taken over for a moment by Wetiko and think, oh, that person, like Netanyahu, he's, yeah, I talk about it. He's like the biggest Wetiko on the planet, pretty much. He's embodying the archetype of Wetiko. But if you think that he's separate from you and that he has Wetiko and you don't, then that perspective is showing you're under the thrall of the bug. Because another way of describing Wetiko, it's a misidentification with who you think you think you're a separate self. And as soon as you think you're a separate self, there's an other. And as soon as there's an other, there's fear. And that's the superfood Wetiko, and that just self-reinforces. It's a feedback loop. But if you recognize, oh, whoever that is, Netanyahu or whoever, they're like taken over by Wetiko. Oh, and they're a dream character. Oh, they're reflecting that part of me. Then that perspective is an invitation for you to inquire into your own darkness and your own evil. And that perspective is the perspective that dispels Wetiko.
Well, I'm a firm believer that these last 4 years have been beautiful, wonderful, and amazing for everyone that has had the lovely opportunity to experience the stresses and challenges that have come, because it's given, as you said, everyone a possibility of understanding what you just mentioned.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, it's like, it's easy. We have all the evidence that we need to think, well, things are going to hell in a handbasket and we're doomed. And it's just so many like catastrophes are converging. And, we can get really easily into despair and pessimism and all that. But that's a big mistake, because if we get fixed in that viewpoint, then we're part of the problem. Then we're going to draw evidence to confirm our point of view. You see, that's the dreamlike nature. Like if I could just, explain that more, because it's so profound and it's so simple. So, just if we can, via our imagination, imagine we're in a dream, in a night dream, right? Now, if I'm holding a viewpoint in a night dream, how is the night dream going to manifest. It's going to reflect the viewpoint, because the night dream is nothing other than my own mind. It's my own psyche. So if I'm holding a viewpoint, the dream will give me all the evidence confirming the viewpoint. And as soon as that happens, then I get even more convinced and fixed and entrenched in the viewpoint, thinking that it's true. And the more I become entrenched in the viewpoint, the more the dream will just offer me even more confirmation, that proves the accuracy of my viewpoint. Ad infinitum. It's a self-reinforcing feedback loop in which we have hypnotized ourselves via our own creative genius. That's Wetiko. Okay. So for example, if in that dream, in that night dream, if I think, oh, this world out there is objective and separate, well, then the world will manifest in such a way, absolutely confirming my point of view that it's objective and separate. And now I have evidence. So I get even more fixed in that viewpoint. And if the world's objective, at the same time, I'm creating myself as a subject, as an ego, as a separate self. The experience of a subject, of an ego, and the experience of an objective world out there that's separate from our ego, they, in this mutual way, reciprocally reinforce each other. That's the illusion generating an illusion. And that's a way of understanding Wetiko. And what I'm pointing out is seeing through that illusion. And then you discover, oh, who am I? Oh, because it's such a cliche. Oh, just to remember who you are. Well, who are we? And I point out, well, when you realize who you are, what do you realize? You realize that your nature is creative by definition. That's our nature. And when you realize your nature is creative, you embody it. You express yourself creatively. And the more you do that, the more you deepen your realization of your nature. It's a positive feedback loop. That's why I keep on saying that the medicine for Wetiko is to be creative. You see, because here Wetiko is potentially destroying our species, and yet it's catalyzing the evolution of our species in potential. It's awakening our species in potential, because it's a quantum phenomena. And quantum physics was showing this isn't like a deterministic universe. Everything exists in a state of quantum potentiality. So is Wetiko going to take us down, or is it going to wake us up? It depends. It depends if we recognize what it's revealing to us. It's this revelation. It's a living revelation. It's showing us who we are. It's showing us our darkness. It's showing us our light. And by saying who we are, who are we? We don't exist as a separate self. That's the primary illusion. We are interconnected with each other, with everyone. We are interdependent. Okay. And seeing that, guess what? Opens your heart, unlocks great compassion, unlocks your creative spirit. And then we become contagious. When we embody that, then all of a sudden, other people's unconscious psyches, they feel that vibration. It's like if a bunch of caterpillars, if one turns into a butterfly and flies away, and then comes back and hangs out with his caterpillar friends, the caterpillar friends are more likely going to start quickly sprouting butterfly wings, because they unconsciously recognize their own image in that fully actualized butterfly. That's why, you see, this can go viral when enough of us get switched on. And it's great that one person gets switched on, but their life will improve. But so what? That doesn't do much. But when we get to connect with other people who are also plugged in and in sync and, awakening in the dream, we can actually, it's not a competitive sport who's more awake. It's like, no, if I help you, I get as much benefit because we're not separate. That's the contagion. That's in a way, the anti-contagion to the contagion of Wetiko. And that's what my work is about, trying to really, to spread this vision.
So I can honestly say, I want to continue from this point, meeting a superhero is an amazing feeling, and someone who doesn't, let's say, have the characteristics, let's say, you look like a normal person, a normal fellow who's had, a regular background, and yet you're doing superheroic work, in my opinion. Perhaps the most important work on the planet right now is what you just mentioned, in getting yourself together and then sharing that with other people. Let's talk about relationships. Let's say people are married, or they have a girlfriend or a boyfriend or whatever. How would you integrate what you've mentioned in that work in relation to what a lot of people think is some of the most important work of their life is like finding a partner, finding love. Like, how would you equate all of this to love? And that's sort of a goal that a lot of people seem to have, in relation
Yeah,
to
yeah,
having a
yeah.
happy life.
And
Yeah.
that's great. I mean, that's a very wholesome, this natural impulse. Unfortunately, a lot of people, it gets filtered through their wounding, and they're trying to find somebody else to complete them, to fill that void in them. And intrinsic, to that dynamic, there's going to be problems. And what it brings up too, like in my current book, on Wetiko, the third one, I think it's the first chapter. I talk about, oh no, it might be the second chapter, that the main channel that Wetiko operates is through relationships.
Mm.
Where all of a sudden, you're good friends with someone, or you're happily married, and there'll be like a misunderstanding. And then, the person will feel not seen, or it'll get inflamed, and it'll create separation between the people. And then they can even get divorced or end their friendship or whatever. And, behind the scenes, you can envision Wetiko is just like delighted that it's created more separation, you know. And so, it brings up, I mean, one of the things I do, I have all these groups, I have 4 per week, sometimes 5. 2 are in my living room in person, but 2 are international. And the idea being, in Tibetan Buddhism, they talk about the Sangha, the community, one of the 3 jewels, that's the foundation of enlightenment. And the idea being that there is a way of hanging out with each other that can further our own awakening, but like pretty much, you can guarantee that when you have the intention to transduce light, coming together as a couple or as a group of people, a community, you're going to invite a guest, and the guest is the unconscious. And it's going to act itself out in this potentially separative way that can be really hurtful and polarizing and all that, but in the groups that I lead, the sense is that, oh, that's what we're waiting for. Like in alchemy, they talk about the raw material, the prima materia. That's the stuff out of which you make the gold, out of which you even deepen your connection and deepen your awakening. And so, that's a major part of my work. It's something I do all throughout the week, of bringing people together in a way, where we play out our stuff and our unconscious acts out, but it's like a hermetic vessel. It's an alchemical container, and there's a way of contemplating it, of like reflecting upon what we're acting out that can actually help us to deepen our understanding of our nature. But if we don't do that, it can go the other way and create incredible hurt and separation and misunderstanding, and that's tragic.
Have you seen a difference in the way that, let's say, men and women envision Wetiko or deal with it? Like something concrete?
Yeah, well, everybody has their own. If people have the patience or whatever it is, the wherewithal to listen to me and be interested and curious and hear what I'm trying to point out, invariably, everybody will have their own version of it, whether they're men or women or whatever. And, and it's almost like tailor suited to the person is their, kind of living example. Oh, yeah, I was an alcoholic. Oh, I was a drug addict. Oh, I was like a victim of abuse. So, whatever the story is. And what I'm pointing out is that when you zoom out to a meta perspective, there's like this overarching, point of view that the origin is the same, and it's as if, and keep in mind, I'm glad I'm remembering to say this, like a lot of spiritual people, like I know a lot of them who are like, no, I don't want to put my attention on the darkness, on evil, and on the shadow. I'm just all about love and light. And I try to point out, well, yeah, you don't want to become fascinated by evil or the darkness, but if you're avoiding, looking at it, turning a blind eye, you're unwittingly feeding it. And, in so many traditions, actually, even in Tibetan Buddhism, one of the famous, enlightened beings, Shanti Deva, he wrote the classic, The Way of the Bodhisattva. So he's often identified as being like a fully actualized bodhisattva. And, and the word bodhisattva actually translates, my favorite definition is a being in the process of awakening. And who among us is not a potential bodhisattva? And Shani Deva, it's all about like us connecting with our bodhisattva nature, with our Buddha nature, with our true nature. And what is his main thing? His main thing is, there's something in my psyche that's stopping me from being fully actualized, that's fighting me, that's like adversarial, that's numbing my senses, that's putting me under a spell. What is that? And he's just one example. And every tradition, they ultimately are saying, yeah, we have to come to terms with what is this counterforce. And it's not out there. We might subjectively experience as if it's like an entity out there. But that's our subjective experience. But I'm pointing out that ultimately speaking, no, it's in us. It's not something separate from us.
Would you say that's where currently, because this comes up a lot in my conversations, AI is supposedly hiding behind Wetiko, or Wetiko's hiding behind AI? It's another trick of the virus.
Well, that's another crazy thing with all of the unbelievable stuff going on in the world with like, the war in Ukraine and the Middle East and, just how our liberties are being taken away and COVID and Trump and Biden and blah, blah, blah. Then on top of that, there's AI, which is like of a different order. And that's where a lot of people connect that with like, ETs, with negative ETs. They're trying to turn us, into their own instrument and make us zombies and take away our humanity. And AI has incredible positive aspect, but an incredibly scary negative aspect. And it just brings up, just to associate, like I'm working on a dream, the importance of us to connect with being human beings and our humanity, and with our soul and with our heart and with our empathy and with our love and compassion. That, I see so many people who are just checked out and making the best of it. And in a way, they're like the Walking Dead. They're like zombies. I wrote an article about this. It's on my website called The Invasion of the Body Snatchers Comes to Life. That what was represented in that movie, that's actually what's happening. Like people, there's such mind control with the propaganda, and people will just be like parroting what they've been told is true. And in a way, it's like the algorithm just speaking through them, and they're thinking they know what's happening. They've done their research without having any idea that they're mind controlled. I mean, it's like so frightening.
I would agree. Well, who do you think maybe like an algorithm needs to be coded? Do you think we're self-coding our own algorithm, or do you think that has something to do with Wetiko? Because, they're parroting the algorithm, but a lot of people don't consider that someone had to code the algorithm in the first place. Someone.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that, AI or the darker powers that be could code all the algorithms they want. But ultimately speaking, it's our responsibility whether we go belly up and outsource our own authority and our own sense making, to whoever the authority is. And that's why, I'm not the only one, just the importance of being an empiricist and really, really owning our own creative agency and our own, being an author, our own authority. We are the ones who are dreaming. But if you don't know you're dreaming, then you feel victimized, and then you feel passive, and the dream is just happening to you, But in a dream, when you recognize the nature of your situation, i.e. that you're dreaming, that you're inhabiting, you're inside of your psyche, then all of a sudden, you're connecting with, wait a second, I have a creative power. I'm the one. This is what quantum physics actually discovered. In essence, I wrote a whole book on quantum physics because of this. So if I can just take a step back and just contextualize quantum physics. So it came into the world, a century ago, more or less, and it came into our minds too. And before quantum physics, the classical physicists conceived of this world as being objective and separate. And they were just trying to understand it in a passive way. And then quantum physics came along, and it absolutely empirically proved again and again and again that the idea of an objective world is just that, an idea. There's no correlate to reality. And a way of saying that is that the act of actually observing this universe influences the universe observed. Footnote, that's a description of a dream, right? If you change the way you're perceiving or interpreting the dream has no choice but to spontaneously shapeshift because it is nothing other than your own mind reflected back to you. Okay. So basically, when quantum physics discovered that, they discovered that the act of observation is creative. See, that's the rabbit hole I go down in my book. And that's pointing out that we ourselves are creating our experience. Mm. There's no one else doing that. Whatever's happening is happening. We then interpret what's happening and place meaning on it in a way where we create our experience. There's no one doing that to us. We are the agents. We are the ones having the creative power. But to the extent we don't know we have the creative power, we outsource it and give it away to the state or to like mommy and daddy or to whoever, And so in a sense, so quantum physics is actually by proving that there's no such thing as an objective reality separate from your own mind. What quantum physics has discovered, in essence, and keep in mind, I'm not a physicist, and the traditionally trained academic corporate physicists are not trained to recognize. A lot of them are saying, we still haven't gotten to the central message. What's the central message of quantum physics? We intuit it's going to be something incredibly simple. We can put it on a t-shirt. We can describe it in one sentence, in 5 words. And I'm not a physicist, but I've been pointing out quantum physics has absolutely empirically proven that this is a dream. We are literally co-dreaming up this dream into manifestation moment by moment. But because we've all been traumatized and conditioned and programmed, we're dreaming it up in this horrendous, nightmarish way. Because Wetiko is the nightmare mind virus. When we're afflicted with it, we create nightmares. And what I'm trying to point out is like, hey, just like you can wake up in your night dream, you can wake up in the waking dream. And when you do that and connect with other people who are waking up in the waking dream, you can put your lucidity together. And it's what I call you can dream ourselves awake. That's evolutionary. And how did that happen? It's because of Wetiko. You see, Wetiko is the catalyst for us to discover who we are and for us to discover our creativity, our genius, that we're already awake. That's why I say it's a quantum phenomena. Is it like the evil or is it like on the side of light? Well, it depends on if you recognize what it's showing you.
I would agree 1,000%. Well, perhaps we've come to a natural conclusion in this lovely conversation. I mean, there's other ways we could segue, a conversation perhaps for another time, but I've really enjoyed the simplistic, friendly, and loving way that you've shared this without getting confrontational whatsoever, without making it complicated, with showing the simplicity of waking up for the dream and how anybody that chooses to can do it. So, I want to thank you so much for, elucidating what could have been a complicated topic in such a simple way for our viewers to understand.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm really happy to do that. Thank you.
Well, I will leave a link to Paul's website where he has his 5 books still available. He's got a million beautiful, wonderful articles. There's a very long definition of Wetiko I was going through myself this morning for anybody who wants a further deep dive into it. That goes on for many paragraphs, I've noticed. And of course, he's got wonderful books. He does live work, all kinds of things. And I've met and discussed this with hundreds of people. And to be honest, I haven't come across anybody yet who I would recommend that if you have these challenges, you visit their website, you maybe do some work with them if he's accepting you customers and clients, and you do some further research yourself, because it seems to me Paul is the real deal. So that is something I've had the honor of discussing over this last hour. Thank you so much, Paul, for being here.
Well, really, just thank you so much for the invite. Really, thank you.
I appreciate it. All right, everyone. So if you have any questions for Paul, go to his website. If you want to leave something for us to discuss at a future time, please, share, comment, and all those lovely things. And I would be delighted to talk with him again as a future time as we can. So thank you again, Paul. I hope to see you again soon.
For sure. Hope so. Take care.
No one tells me where I should start.